Kia ora koutou katoa, everyone. Welcome to the first 2022 Tuia Pita Ora NZILA Streetscape webinar presentation. Just to kick off, I'd like to thank our sponsor Streetscape for their continued support of the Institute and helping us bring these webinars to you. We're grateful for their ongoing support and partnership, and we'll kick off with a brief video from them.
Streetscape is New Zealand's leading manufacturer of quality street furniture, lighting poles, shelters, and sculptures that breathe life into our open space environments. Collaborating with landscape architects and designers to share our manufacturing expertise and experience, we create solutions to meet your design brief, your budget, and your project delivery deadline. At Streetscape, we have a great range of off-the-shelf furniture. Together, we can modify and customize our existing ranges to suit, or we can provide the design support to manufacture fully bespoke furniture for your project. With all furniture proudly manufactured in New Zealand from locally and ethically sourced materials, and with over 100 years of combined experience, you can be sure of the craftsmanship. Quality products made to withstand our unique environmental conditions while meeting all local health and safety standards. Local doesn't just mean local knowledge and local jobs. It also means reduced lead times and a local team who manage every step of the way with you to see the project from your concept through to final delivery. Aotearoa, New Zealand, these are our places, our communities, our environments, and we want you to enjoy them the way you imagine them. That's why we go that extra mile every time. Streetscape, turning your imagination into reality. Streetscape, in conjunction with the NZILA, are proud to sponsor the Streetscape Speaker Series.
Well, thanks again to Streetscape for their support. Really looking forward to today's presentation. As usual, we'll have some time for some questions at the end. So if you have any of those that come up along the way, please put those into the menu using the icon located at the bottom of your screen. So let's get into it. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Giulia Frittoli. Giulia was named as BIG Landscape Partner in 2021 and is an instrumental leader within BIG Landscape. She's recently moved to Copenhagen after spending 3 years living and working in New York City. A senior landscape architect with a multidisciplinary background in urban design, architecture, and landscape architecture. Giulia led the proposal for Toyota Woven City, investigating how recent technologies will shape the future of cities in regard to new forms of mobility, sustainability, ecology, and human connectivity. Today, Giulia will address the topic of urban landscapes as public space and biodiversity. BIG Landscape works with architects and other disciplines to integrate the built and natural worlds, connecting people to people and people to nature. So welcome, Giulia.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really excited about this opportunity. I'm looking forward to walk you through what we do here at BIG. And at BIG, we are actually in Copenhagen. I'm in Copenhagen right now. You can probably recognize the windows behind me. And actually, we are much larger than what you can see in these photos being taken a while ago. We are 350 people today in this space. And but you can give you a sense of where we are and when we work. We have 5 offices globally, 600 employees, and we have 35 landscape architects spread between Copenhagen, London, and New York. In Copenhagen, we actually have a team of 25 landscape architects to date, and we work very closely with our architects, engineers, and all the other expertise that we have in-house at BIG. And we share the main space. We actually have plants on every desk, so it's very hard to miss us. We work on very different scales of projects, from like the bench scales all the way to regional master planning. And a lot of our work actually integrates different disciplines. And of course, like most of BIG's work is known for architectures and buildings, but we have been focusing more and more on really growing our landscape portfolio. And I'm very excited today to show you a few of our works and how we actually work within our environment, which is extremely multidisciplinary. And I often make the joke that actually BIG started as a landscape architecture firm, which is not that wrong, because actually in 2002, even just before BIG started, we have contributed to bringing people to the harbor of Copenhagen, transforming what was just an infrastructure for trade to actually an infrastructure for people. And also with the Maritime Youth House, we really brought people to experience the waterfront of Copenhagen. We also tried in 2004 to really bring communities and residents to the rooftop of a cityscape, the historic city center of Copenhagen doesn't allow yet this type of public space. And we also started to reactivate forgotten areas in Copenhagen, like the Superkilden Square, where really the diversity of the people living in the neighborhood has been brought into the public space with this eclectic mosaic of different urban elements that represent the different nationalities of the people coming together in this place they can sort of call home. And our work really started at the beginning focusing on public space and landscape architecture because of the Danish sense of community. I'm living in Denmark now after New York, and I can really experience this sense of community and connection between the public here in Denmark. But over time, BIG started to actually integrate more and more landscape and integrated architecture and landscape architecture within together within the buildings, arriving to the point where we really realized that we had to break the silos, break the different disciplines, and start working much more closely one another since the early design process to really try to tackle climate change and other cultural challenges that we face today. So in 2015, we actually founded BIG Landscape, and today we are really working on our different scales of projects that are tending to be more and more complex, addressing the future. We call our world here at BIG the Big Leap, and we actually represent landscape engineering, architecture, and product. And we have all this expertise in-house, and we actually see the landscape team sits just right between the engineering team and the product team and the architecture, and it's really nice how we can work together. And we as landscape architects, we really have that kind of discipline that really interacts with the different levels of design, from the architecture with landscape it is around the building, inside or above, with actually engineering, how do we build landscape on structure, how do we tackle the climate and the environment, but also working much closer with our industrial designer for product design, urban elements, and lighting. And I will walk you through a few projects that actually go from the smaller scale to the larger scale that kind of give you a sense of how we work here at BIG within our team. This is the spiral project. You can recognize the green spiral around the tower. It's in New York in Hudson Yards. And it's one of the tallest towers actually that are at the moment coming up in New York. And what we actually looked at is creating a new form of public space, a spiraling terrace system that goes all the way up to 300-meter high. That really creates a different experience, almost a biophilic experience for all the workers within this office building, but at the same time also addresses sustainability and passive irrigation system. You can see here that actually the skyline of Manhattan is extremely, is really lacking of open space, and you can see how the spiral really can create a different type of public space within the skyline of New York. New York bringing nature also, not only people, all the way up. And the different terraces actually that are around the tower are very different. We go from the large terraces to the small terraces to the corner terraces. And what we worked on is actually to think about a landscape concept that managed to bring nature and plantings and people into these terraces, but also emphasizes this continuous terracing and the spiraling of the vegetation all the way up. So we worked on actually vegetation on a horizontal plane, but also on a vertical plane, connecting the spiral one another. So you can see from this image, this continued cascading of green elements connecting all the terraces. And also you can see what we call the taco planters, that actually are planters that have the vertical side with exposed vegetation. And of course, like creating new type of public spaces, especially in this case, something that hasn't been done before, comes with a lot of challenges. Challenges such as, of course, code compliance or allow washing for the facades, but also thinking about views and safety. But also big challenges come with the climate, because actually the climate really changes from the bottom to the top of the tower. It's really a different climate zone. And here's an example of how we work very closely with the environmental engineers, where we look at solar orientation, wind exposure, how the vegetation needs to change because of the altitudes, but also the season and the time of the day. And we actually managed to simulate different scenarios of wind exposure or sun exposure to actually understand what type of climate these terraces have. And what we actually arrived at is actually there are 3 different climate zones around the tower. And each of them, of course, corresponds a different planting palette, because we have a different exposure to sun and a different, of course, exposure to wind. And this planting palette actually goes from the planter all the way to the vertical elements and the trellis. So it's really like a really continuous green spiral around the tower that adapts to the climate that it encounters while turning around the tower. And you can see here an image of the summer time, of the springtime, and the summer and the fall and the winter. So we really designed the terraces also with in mind not only the summertime, where actually people will mostly be outdoor, but also how does it feel the space during the other season. We also looked at flexibility, because of course there will be different tenants who will be leasing the different office spaces. So we look at a sort of plug and play system where we create infrastructure such as irrigation and an allowance for and structural load allowance for the planters, but allowing also different tenants to kind of reconfigure the terraces as they would like to during the time. And here you can see today, that's the image of a few months ago of the spiral that just recently popped up in New York. You can already recognize the terraces in the facade. And here you can see the first, this is the large terrace where you can see already installed the planters with the trellis and the benches. And we actually have started a few months ago to test plants, so then we can see how they behave in the different climate zones. And so far, so good. And you can see actually in the photo, the taco, what we call the taco planter with the vertical side exposed. And this is it's a small project, but it's a very different experience for the city of New York, not only from the skyline, for what you actually can see from the ground floor, but especially being inside a workplace and really having the opportunity to experience outdoor space at altitude that otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. And I think the spiral is an example of like landscape almost on top of the building, but we also have example of landscape that goes on a ground plane. How do we extend the architecture and we connect the architecture and the landscape on the ground plane? And we actually worked a couple of years ago on the Henning Kruse Plaza here in Esbjerg in Denmark. And Henning Kruse actually is a renowned person within the Esbjerg community. Is famous for his contribution to the shipping industry, and he founded a foundation for cultural programming, and he decided to actually restore the plaza in front of the music hall of Esbjerg, which was designed by Utzon, and really try to find a way to create a public space that enhances the architecture that is there today. And you can see also from the view inside the building, this beautiful colonnade that creates sort of a buffer between the really inside, the part inside of the building, the music hall, to actually the outdoor. So there is kind of this indoor-outdoor relationship. So we actually looking at addressing the plaza design and how do we create a city space that really celebrates the architecture. We start removing all the objects that were kind of disturbing the space and they were maybe not required. And we looked at this column grid, this colonnade that actually creates the buffer and the interface between the inside and the outside. And we extended this color grid out. We created a destination, which is what missing today, an element that really marks the fact that it's a new destination for the city and it gives importance to the city space. In this case, we created a fountain, a wave pool, which we'll see later. And we, like almost the extension of the columns all the way to the outside of the plaza, we located birch trees that are actually modified in order to not allow for allergies. And we really created this extension of almost a natural colonnade that comes all the way out to the plaza and really becomes a vibrant urban space that keeps the kind of hardscape on the ground plane, but also create this kind of canopy layer that continues the colonnade outside. And here is an image from above where you can actually see the grid continuing out and distorting to really create and embrace almost the central element, the wave pool. And actually the entire plaza is conceived as a planter, so it's fully on a structural soil. And each tree is actually sitting at the intersection of the steel plate within the pavement, which is the exact same treatment of the columns on the inside of the building. And here you can see the relation between the column with the canopy with the tree. So this kind of extension where you almost cannot tell the buffer when you are within the landscape realm or within the architecture realm. And people are really enjoying the space, especially in summer where it's warm enough. And really the fountain, the wave pool really brings people to the site. And you can see that the pool actually has this sort of ripples over the surface, and it's actually these waves are generated by vibrations that come from the music hall of the theater. So actually through speakers and other devices, we managed to kind of translate the music that you wouldn't hear from the outdoor as a visual effect within the plaza, to really try to connect in an even stronger way the indoor and the outdoor of the space. Here you can see the detailing of the pool and how it meets the pavement. And in the same way as the indoor, the column of the building actually sits at the intersection of the floor tiles, we created a same experience on the outdoor, where all the different elements of the public space are actually extending the same logic and sitting in between the still edges of the square. And I think what's interesting is actually the Henning Kroos Plaza is landscape that comes after a building is built. But we also have examples of how landscape comes before the buildings are built, or why the buildings are built. And this is the Harbor Bath master plan in Aarhus, where we actually had to develop a master plan in the harbor area. And we really looked at the waterfront experience and understanding how can we bring people to the waterfront, how can we create a sense of destination that is really not there, was really not there at the time before the intervention. So from a linear kind of waterfront experience, we looked at a much more dynamic waterfront experience that creates sort of pockets of public spaces and different activities. They can really create a sense of destination, a place for people to come and be and enjoy the waterfront and the relation with the water. And just right behind this dynamic waterfront creates the 4 city plots that then are filled in with the building envelopes. And we carefully shaped the building envelopes in order to allow for privacy, but also the perfect amount of daylight along all the facades. And we also looked at creating courtyards. So then there is a sort of transition between the private space inside the courtyard and the public space on the outside. And it really becomes a place where the ground plane is very active, but also there is a strong distinction between what is public and what is active and what is more like passive and secluded, like the courtyard space inside the residences. And here is an image of how the area will look like in a few years from now. But we actually, as I just mentioned before, we built already the waterfront as the first step to actually create the master plan and create this destination. So here you can see the arbor bath with just behind the small containers and the little cabins that are actually bringing program to the waterfront and activate the waterfront since day one. But at the same time, they kind of serve as a barrier. They're kind of a wall that protects the construction site at the back while allowing people to experience the waterfront during the construction. And BIG is actually in charge of the 3 buildings that you can see behind, while the 2 courtyards have been developed by other architects, and we have developed with the landscape team the arbor bath in the front. And we will develop, of course, all the sidewalks once the buildings are ready. And it's really amazing how this almost like a simple gesture really brought a new life to an area that otherwise wouldn't have life at all. And it was extremely infrastructure. So it's really now a sort of key public space within the city of Aarhus. And another example is actually projects where the building is already there, and we sort of need to work with the public space around it to really actually activate maybe areas of the buildings or the facades that are not activated today. And this is an example in downtown Brooklyn, where we work on this 350-hectare master plan, where actually you can see from this image already how gray and how built the core of downtown Brooklyn feels, and really is lacking a lot of not only trees, but also public programming along the street and the sidewalk. You can see that, of course, our first design approach at a master plan scale was actually to try to find a way to integrate as much more greenery as we can. And of course, it comes in various forms because of a lot of constraints that exist today on the site. For instance, whether there are utilities or sidewalks, then it should be in raised planters. Maybe we have areas where we have blind walls that we can activate with green walls. Or we have other areas where we can actually work with bioswales and in-ground planting. And we also looked at not only activating the sidewalk, but like seeing how much traffic we can actually reduce in the streets of downtown Brooklyn. And you can see here today, or like yesterday, last year, there were only 3 to 4 shared streets in the old neighborhood. And we really looked at a way to maximize the shared street by removing parking wherever possible by closing down streets where the traffic would allow to do that. And we really look at the block in a different way, because the sidewalk really feels today as a place just to move around, almost like an area where you can pass by. It doesn't really feel like a destination, but by actually offsetting the sidewalk, taking over wherever possible the parking space, there is really an opportunity to almost soften the edge of the sidewalk to make it feel almost like a plaza rather than a sidewalk, really like a core destination within the public realm. That's what we actually call bubble. And these bubbles start actually adapting and distorting to really take care of the conditions and incorporate the conditions that happen along the sidewalk, creating plazas or new type of crosswalks, or extending all the way through the street when we could pedestrianize certain alleyways, or create shared streets or boulevards or colors. We actually were quite interesting about creating a much more playful environment rather than the gray environment, the gray landscape it is today within the downtown Brooklyn area. And as you can see here, each of the colors actually reflect the programming that is happening in around the building, so that it really creates also a sense of connection between what happens on the ground floor with what happens in the street. And we look at not only at different colors, but also different materials and in different forms to really create a kind of cohesive image for downtown Brooklyn, but at the same time allow for diversity. So in the areas where it's possible, there are more residents and it could be a little bit more playful and soft. We really played with curves and kind of soft element that can really activate the street. And you can really see from these images that there's rarely in downtown Brooklyn, there is a lot of loading area and a lot of blind walls. So it's really the colors and the streets and the furniture really help bring in life to streetscape that actually wouldn't have that much life yet, but also becomes an opportunity when the sidewalk can become wide enough to incorporate much more green, almost like a plaza or a park. For the kind of a blue zone, we looked in its more slender form, something more like tube-like and movable elements that really can create a kind of very dynamic feeling. And most of this relates also to sport. This is an example of an alleyway. You can see the same condition, really no programming on the ground floor, but also an opportunity to really create almost a public courtyard for everyone to enjoy the landscape, almost a playground for the residents around the blocks. But also looking at other forms, a little bit maybe more urban of elements that are much more linear, and maybe it could be built out of wood. And this is an example of another street in Brooklyn, again, with a lot of parking and no activation in the facade, and how this furniture, but also like removing the parking, really looking maybe at a more meandering flow, can really change the experience of the street. And this was a very interesting process. We worked for a year together with the Downtown Brooklyn BID on the vision, and this translated into 8 pilot projects. We have designed the pilot project that you can see here in the middle of the image, while the one that you can see close to Barclays Center is the bottom right, are being designed by WXY architecture office. And the main challenge was actually that we needed to create a sort of implementable phase of the master plan. So this kind of bubble landscape needs to really work in an area where there's different stakeholders, there are different building owners, and needs to be built over time. And some of the projects might be more temporary, and some of the projects actually could be more permanent. So what we look at is actually sort of a difference in scale of this, what we call bubbles, from small bubbles that could be just more almost temporary to really create a sense of playfulness and destination, to actually bubbles that really extend all the way to the plot, around the plot whenever possible. And this is an example of Hoyt Street. You can see on the left side what it is today, or up until a few months ago, where there's a lot of parking space and a very reduced area for the pedestrian and the sidewalk. And on the right side, how we tried actually to implement as much green as we could, given the constraints, but at the same time also reducing the space for vehicles in order to widen in the streetscape. And also, like, the challenge is that every urban element that needs to be placed on public ground needs to be approved by the DOT and PDC, who are the Planning and Transportation Department of the City of Brooklyn and New York. So we really worked in a way to kind of downplay a little bit the toolkit that we originally had and incorporate certain elements that are more off the shelf, but also we had a lot of discussion about colors with the client and with all the developers and the stakeholders around the area. And for now we have gray, black, and yellow allowed, but like over time, I think what we hope for is that we could integrate more and more elements to this toolkit. So we actually have now a first series of urban elements that can be activating and placed around downtown Brooklyn. And this is an example actually of a client that really wanted to create a much more permanent public realm. So rather than actually using color and paint, we really work with pink granite, and really how we could create this kind of soft shape with rather than with paint or with colors, actually with stone. And you can see here the area for the planters to be located, the raised planters to be located. But you can see also the areas where the planters actually can happen in ground. So you can see here the comparison between in-ground planter around existing trees and new plantings that will be added, but also planters above ground where there's subway below, there is utilities that don't allow for that. And this is the first of the 4 sidewalks that we are designing, will open in just a few months. And 2 more will be coming this year. And we are really excited to see how actually the overall vision has been broken down in small pilot projects that are like being over time implemented around downtown Brooklyn. And hopefully in a few years, the full puzzle will be actually completed. And I wanted to conclude with a project that I think represents probably at best the way we integrate landscape architecture and architecture and other different disciplines at BIG, but also how can we actually think about projects most of the time starting from the landscape perspective rather than the architecture. And this is Toyota Woven City. We were asked by Toyota actually from Japan to really think about a different type of city that is designed for autonomous vehicles. And they had a site available, and this is the site in Susono, it's just 1 hour south of Tokyo, where we had to basically design a city from scratch, where the kind of brief was how would the city of the future would look like if autonomous vehicles will replace automobiles as we know them today. And what we actually start studying is actually how mobility has shaped the city that we live today, or we live from the past all the way to today and maybe the future. And you can see that, of course, like there was like a much more like the medieval city was really designed by pedestrian flows and people really inhabiting the space and connecting major points and plazas within the city. And then the kind of organic pattern became more and more segregated from of course, the boulevards to allow for much more life, but also for the horse carriages in Paris or in Barcelona. And then, of course, to the roads and grids that are much more efficient and functional for cars, all the way to highway that is really disconnecting and separating neighborhoods. And we really looked at at automation really as a way to almost rethink mobility and maybe bring back people and other forms of mobility to the city much more than cars. And this is an example actually of the urban block in Tokyo. And you can see the different streets. There is really a fine grain of different streets that go from like the large boulevard that of course have like cars and like all the traffic components, all the layers, the main subways are all connected to, but also like the different type of public space where you can actually allow to find really like very human scale and very active little streets that have extremely charm. And I think it's the most beautiful part probably of the city of Tokyo, but also residential streets that are extremely green, that you almost, when you just walk into it, you just feel like you're just in a park. And we were really inspired by like the diversity of streets. And we thought like maybe rather than looking at autonomous vehicles to be implemented in streets as we know them today, what if we would actually rethink mobility and look at not only at cars, but also bikes and other forms of mobility and pedestrian as well. So we actually split apart the streets as we know it today from the vehicular road to the sidewalk and the bike lane. And we actually interwove them in a different way, creating this kind of 9 by 9 grids, almost like a Sudoku grid, where you can actually access from the vehicular road running on the perimeter, you can access 8 of the blocks. And the block in the middle that is actually not accessed by a vehicular road, we decided to turn it into a public corridor where actually the bike lane and the pedestrian lane could really frame this area. And the 8 buildings around will become the building block framing the central public space. And this is kind of the city block, which is it's a 150 meter by 150 meter city block. And if you would just multiply, then you could form a city. But then we also looked at a necessity to create a much larger public space. What if it's a plaza, or if it's a park at the scale of the city, not just the scale of the block? So we looked at actually distorting the grid. And by distorting the grid, we actually allow every street to be continuous. But at the same time, we allow a very different dimension and size and type of public space, but also for the building. So it really creates variety by never disconnecting the grid. And this is where the Toyota Woven City concept is coming from. You can see here the implemented, the 3 phases of the project. We are currently it's under phase 1, which is the first triangle in the front, is currently under construction. And what is interesting is that it becomes a sort of city where not only mobility is equal between cars, bikes, and pedestrians, but also the amount of nature and the amount of space dedicated to building and space dedicated to mobility is almost equal, where it's almost 30% of the cityscape. And we also looked at the grid as a way to think about the city of the future as a model where every city of today could retrofit to. So you could imagine Barcelona, New York, or Tokyo to really close down certain streets from traffic, which is actually living in New York during COVID. That's what we experienced. A lot of streets actually closed down, and they were turned into sort of areas just completely pedestrian streets. And that's something interesting about thinking about the city of the future as something that every city can retrofit to without really being designed always from scratch. And here you can see the model. You can see all lead up actually all the courtyards and the public space of the city, and how actually everything is extremely interconnected. So you can imagine with the pedestrian streets to really walk along the entire city and connect all the courtyards and all the plazas. This is an example of the scale of the courtyard within the eight building blocks, where we actually designed the 3 streets in 3 different ways, and we really looked at blending the more natural component of the pedestrian street with the more civic component of what we call the promenade for the bikes and the pedestrian. And here you can see really the scale of the public space, and also the kind of ratio between the soft scale and the hard scale that allows for a very natural environment, but as well also area that can be very functional and where vehicles can access where they need to. Here's another view of the courtyard, where you can actually see that it's almost designed as a Japanese garden. And you can also see already here that the amount of technology that you see, it's actually limited. So we really focus on designing a city and a public realm that really feels very familiar, that everyone could feel connected to. And the technology is mostly hidden and just helps the city performing much better. Also, what we looked at the new forms of retail. So we actually look at mobile retail, where you can see here on the right side is kind of what Toyota calls e-palette. It's almost like an autonomous van that has different programming in the interior, and can really activate the public space in very different ways. So allowing for flexibility and also different events happening throughout the day and throughout the year. This is an example of the vehicular road as it was designed 3 years ago. You can see that it's mostly a street dedicated for vehicles. There's no need for curbs with autonomous vehicles. So it's just a tree line that actually defines the difference between the sidewalk and the vehicular lane. And you can see the waste management that happens below ground. And this street is a street where we actually tested a maximum of 30 kilometers per hour speed, which allows actually interaction between humans and an autonomous vehicle, which is something that has never been done before. And it's also, here you can see also the drop off and everything, by just a line of tree actually creates the distinction between the pedestrian and the vehicle road, but also all the drop off area. And you can see what we call the Toyota logistics system. Everything that relates to delivery or waste happens below ground and connects of all the residents behind. This is actually an image from our DD set. We just completed a few months ago the DD phase, and we are currently moving forward with the construction documents of the public realm of the woven city. And that's a sketch of how it's the latest rendering of the vehicular road. But you can see we really had to work with the client to understand how to allow flexibility and variety of planting in the street. This is the recreational promenade, so it's a much more meandering street where you just tend to slow down. So for bikes and scooters to really experience the city at a different speed of 15 kilometers per hour, it's much more dynamic. And here we thought that to represent dynamism, actually we wanted also cherry blossom and flowers to really represent the character of the street. And you can see also the paving pattern that highlights the dynamism of this street. Here how it looks in the latest development of the design, and we really had to work with movable elements to allow for flexibility for actually Toyota to allow to test different speed and different way to meander around the city. And last, like we have designed, of course, the pedestrian street is almost conceived as a continuous linear park. It's really like a meandering street between nature, and which is really a minimum path with vegetation towards the building that allows you to kind of feel really lost in nature, even if you are in a complete urban environment. And what we think is successful is that the Toyota Woven City creates kind of separation between the mode of transportation and mobility, but at the same time connection, because we allow actually through sensors and technology to really test for the first time how people interact with autonomous vehicles, because that's the way until today the interaction between humans and autonomous vehicles is tested, and the Toyota Woven City will allow a different way of testing autonomous mobility. But what is relevant that it's, even though it's a city that is born out of the necessity to retrofit to autonomous vehicles, it has resulted in a city that has much more space for people and for nature. And I think this represents a lot of the work we do today, where we actually try to rethink cities in order to be a much better environment for the planet and for humanity. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Giulia. That was a bit of a whirlwind. I sort of feel like I was in drawing and diagram heaven there. Great presentation and great drawing. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Harry.
I'll take one of those sound wave pulls as well, please. Hey, I guess we've got a bit of time for some questions. So for those of you listening in, feel free to drop them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to put you on the spot here a bit, Giulia, but I think it's really interesting to hear how you kind of work in a multidisciplinary and sort of global environment. I guess, could you talk a little bit more about how you kind of do that at a global scale, and how, I guess, as landscape architects, what sort of values and approaches you bring when you're working in across a range of different places and different contexts and different cultures and things?
Yes, it's actually the multidisciplinary approach that we talked about doesn't only happen in-house, but also we have a lot of collaborators we work with that actually bring on a lot of local experience. And I think it's actually important for us that it's not just about the technical feasibility of the design of a project, but it's really understanding the culture. I think for landscape architecture is extremely also much more important than actually architecture, to understand the way culturally people use the space, use the public space, and how do they interact. So that's how we work. We work a lot on engaging local landscape architects, engineers, placemaking consultants, traffic consultants, to really work together and collect on the information that we need to make sure that we address design and solutioning in the best way. And internally, actually, the way we work in a multidisciplinary way is to start all together from day one. I think what I've experienced working in landscape architecture firms only is that sometimes landscape architects are brought on board too late in the game, where actually things are already set by a certain architecture concepts or regulation, and really don't allow for exploration of the different fields, to almost blur the boundary between the building plot and the landscape. And I think here, by working together from day one, so we always have two landscape architects on all the main concept projects that of course require integration with outdoor space here at BIG. And then you open up conversation from the beginning. So we maybe rethink about how does the building create a courtyard? How does the building interact with the public space? Where does the main public space needs to be, or maybe where the building needs to be located on the side, not only in the middle, but there is a sort of urban condition that we most of the time help architects thinking about. And at the same time, I think we do the same process with engineers, as I showed with the spiral. We really try to understand the climate condition in every single project, how the wind, how the light really affects the public space, in order that we create a public space that performs much better and create a comfortable environment. Or at the same time, rather than having buildings that are already defined and then landscape artists need to fight for soil load over the structure to actually create a meaningful rooftop, we are brought on board from day one, and we can already say how much soil we need and how much weight we need to actually create a certain environment. So it's also challenging at times, because it's a lot of people in the same room and a lot of discussion, but we do believe that projects become better and more meaningful by really stop working in silos and really breaking the boundaries between all the disciplines.
Great. I noticed that, in a couple of the projects you talked about, I guess a lot of kind of tactics around, placemaking and kind of, temporary and movable sort of strategies. And is that something that you're finding is happening kind of more and more in the work that you're doing around the world. And I guess I'm sort of interested in this a little bit because I think, we do a bit of that here, but I'm not sure that we always do it quite well or spend enough money on it, perhaps. And some of what you were showing looked, pretty sophisticated and aspirational. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of that kind of work as well.
Yeah, I think actually a lot of it comes also of the interaction with the community. And a lot of the projects that we do come as a desire from the community. I'm thinking about Super Killen or Downtown Brooklyn or other projects we've done where there is a long process of community engagement to actually understand what would residents or visitors would like to see in the public space. And I think that's a main driver to allow for the transformation of public spaces that may be a little forgotten in the cities. And then, of course, I think there is a need to transform public spaces also in relation to also the evolution of the city. For instance, like a project like Downtown Brooklyn actually is really coming from the necessity of creating new buildings. So there are new developers that in order to make their development successful, they need to attract people. So I think a lot of placemaking also kind of relates to the development scenario and the economics behind it. But it is really like a great opportunity to actually transform area of the city where maybe there's really a lack of placemaking and destination.
Good answer. There's a question here about how you work with ecologists. I guess when you're working globally, you probably come across a lot of different environments. So is that something you do in-house or use local people or a combination?
We always have a local arborist in every project we do. Even in Denmark, we are collaborating with a arborist and planning specialist. So we actually really work together with local arborists. For instance, we run the simulation on wind and sun here in-house, and this becomes really a baseline to then open up conversation with local ecologists and planting specialists to also understand also about what I think if we think about resiliency and sustainability, native landscape are an extremely important element when we need to make sure that we incorporate in all the projects we do. So that's why most of the time we always involve arborists and ecologists in order to understand the planting palette, but also in relation to water management. And it's not just about planting itself, but also understanding how do we connect also to a regional scale to the corridor, ecological corridor and wildlife. So yes, we do work a lot with ecologists. We don't have that expertise in-house yet because we are still like just 25, 35 people. So hopefully by the time we grow bigger, we will be able to have ecologists at BIG. But also when you work in so many different countries, it would be pretty impossible to do it in-house. So it's actually extremely exciting to work with local ecologists and learn from every project.
Are you there's a question here about roof gardens and rooftops. I guess that's probably something that working in a big multidisciplinary firm you do a lot of as well. As how are you finding? What are you learning from those sorts of projects?
I think the biggest challenge is I think the secret is to actually coordinate this on time and allow for the right type of soil, which is the right type of load and the right type of planting. And I think I've realized that a lot of maybe examples sometimes might be unsuccessful because of that coordination happening too late in the game, and maybe type of soils that are not appropriate or plants that are not appropriate, or maybe plants that don't respond to the specific type condition of maybe in relation to irrigation and drainage is not set up properly. So I would say that maybe for what we have learned from projects that we are doing currently here, where like 30% of our work is actually landscape over a structure like rooftop or terraces, it's really important to have that conversation happening since day one. We're also on our project in France working with actually a soil consultant who's really helping to really find different soil types with different weights, but at the same time that allow for enough nutrients for the plantings to be successful. So yeah, it's always like the key is always coordinate on time.
Yeah, amen. I've got another question here about, I guess there's probably quite a lot of challenges when you're working again sort of globally in dealing with the different sort of regulatory issues in different places. But I guess probably what we all do as landscape architects sometimes is want to kind of push those boundaries a little bit. Is that certainly something that you are coming across a lot?
Yeah, I think most of the time, actually, we have to break boundaries, but it's always also about like pick your battles. So I think like when we start learning about regulation and what actually the constraints are, it's a lot of work that we do internally at BIG is to understand what is the right thing to do and demonstrate that is actually much better to do in the way we would propose rather than the way that the regulation would work. And I think downtown Brooklyn is almost an example where they have a set of metal benches and it's the same bench that they're using for years. And just by showing that maybe you could do things differently, then we opened up a 1-year-long process to actually get other type of materials approved. We start talking about flexibility, but also sustainability, also placemaking. And I think maybe a lot of time it's a way to, it will slow down the process if you challenge the certain boundaries and constraints. But because we are quite of a large firm and we are also very connected with local consultants and architects in every place we work, we really are able to set up this conversation and discussion. And most of the time we find a good compromise. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, it is a tricky regulations sometimes are too strict.
Got to keep fighting a fight, right?
Exactly.
Hey, there's a kind of detailed question here, but some of your images showed, quite a strong use of color. And there's a question here about what sort of materials you use to kind of deliver some of those colors. It might be a bit technical, but got any insights there in terms of maybe there's some secrets out there that we haven't got over here. We're painting things quite often, so.
I think it's actually an interesting question, and most of the time we use paint or thermoplast, but actually what happens is that you have to maintain it also over time, and maybe it's not the best sustainable way to actually add color. And I think what happens, for instance, with Super Keelan, that at the time, 10 years ago, we worked on with Topotech. At the beginning was a paint thermoplast surface, and over time, actually we replaced it with colorful bricks, with different tones of red. And that's because it's much more durable material and also much more sustainable. So, and the same thing I think you saw with downtown Brooklyn, also the first images, because we always have the feeling or the budget is too low and you still want to make something, a particular ambitions that create a special place in the city, or because maybe some of these projects at the beginning, they are meant to be temporary as almost an experiment to see what we can do. They are proposed with more colored surface, but most of the time our experiences are turned to be actually a material itself and not a paint surface. So then it's much more durable, sustainable, and require less maintenance. So actually Super Keelan, a year ago, we replaced it with brick.
Do you think you have a kind of different, I guess this comes back to this sort of multidisciplinary thing, but do you think you are kind of working towards the idea of just a single set of sort of principles and approaches for BIG, or do you still find that BIG landscape and BIG architecture are sometimes sort of trying to do slightly different things?
I think it depends. I think sometimes they're blend one another. Sometimes they're very different realm. We do here, like the way we set up the landscape team here, that we also do some work, for the sake of a better word, on our own, where it's just landscape, purely landscape projects, like for instance, parks or waterfront. But I have to say that with experience, I have become a better landscape architect by working with architects, because you understand that everyone from different expertise and different disciplines reads the space and the character of the space in a very different way. And it's really by learning of how seeing things from different angles that brings much more meaning to the public space. So I think, and it can also be very frustrating sometimes when you really need to fight for certain things. But so that's why it's also nice to also have landscape only projects. But I would say like the time where at BIG we push more the boundaries is actually when the two disciplines are interconnected, talking about breaking the rules. Or thinking about the spiral, for instance, there is current to date, we couldn't find any precedent of terraces at 1,000 feet tall tower. So by just doing this in-house, we managed to really figure that out.
Mm. And do you find that across the places and projects you work on that there's kind of quite a different approach to sustainability and being carbon positive and those sorts of things, or are you seeing that that's changing kind of rapidly across most of the places that you're working?
I think it's changing a lot of it, because also there's certain regulation that are becoming much more strict. Actually, we are working currently on a project in France, but I'm amazed by how it's mandatory to cover every roof with 75% of green surface, and 70% of plants needs to be native. And there's also a lot of attention into materiality to avoid, of course, concrete. And I think there is globally there is an acceleration towards sustainability and net zero type of development. I would say that maybe from the experience, maybe in Europe, it's a little bit more advanced on that front compared maybe to the US or China, for instance. I think Singapore, for example, is also very advanced on that front. But I think that it's moving towards that direction globally. And I think we learned a lot from COVID. And because like the way we've been rethinking our lives and maybe focusing on what is the future has really changed our perspectives. And we can see here at BIG, after COVID hit, there is actually a much larger amount of work in relation to outdoor space, vegetation, sustainability in relation to actually sustainable water management and materials and plantings and biodiversity. So I think there is a big difference, and we as designers, we also have to adapt, because also sustainability sometimes it's a much bigger investment from day one. Overall, maybe over on a long term would actually be sort of bringing much more benefit, but it doesn't always go through as we would like to be, as ambitious as we would like it to be. But we think it's a trend globally, and we try to incorporate sustainability in every project we do.
You mentioned COVID, and I think everyone's probably sick of talking about COVID, but and you mentioned you learned some things. What sort of things did you learn about and how you work and how you communicate and things?
You mean by working multidisciplinary?
Yeah, I guess whilst being in lockdown and working remotely.
Oh, for the lockdown.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we are doing this call via Zoom, so that's kind of an example. I would really love to actually be there, but I think that's how we learned. I have to say it's been difficult for a firm like ours, where it's a lot of sketching and interaction that actually happens on a face to face in the office or with the consultant. So it's been difficult to adapt at the beginning since COVID hit, and we all had to learn to work on our own and remotely. But because of technology and actually how fast it was possible to transport whatever was happening in the workplace to the house, it really worked efficiently. But we here in Copenhagen, we are all back in the office for now a year and a half, and none of us wants to actually work from home, because it's really we missed a lot that interaction. But despite that, I think it does make some certain things easier, like this is happening, or like other, for instance, working internationally, somehow it became also a little bit easier. Everyone now is used to jump on a video call at any minute, so it's much easier to get in touch with clients and consultants. But let's say from a day-to-day perspective within the team and within BIG, it's just like a in-person sketching session that makes projects at the level we would like them to be.
Awesome. All right. Well, look, thank you, Giulia, and that was amazing. And I reckon you got through about an hour and a half within an hour there. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us all today. And we appreciate that it's 11 o'clock at night in your part of the world. So thanks for staying up late for us. I was talking to Giulia beforehand, and her team's looking to grow. So if anyone out there wants a job in Copenhagen, working at BIG Landscape, I think Giulia would be keen to talk to you. So look, thanks again for your time and your insights and your great work. And it's been a pleasure to meet you, and look forward to seeing some more exciting work in the future. So thanks very much, Giulia. And thanks again to our sponsor, Streetscape, for making this happen. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.